The suppression began in World War I, and the 1920s pro-business government disabused progressives of the notion that government was necessarily good. The response was calls for civil liberties. Open debate became the new goal. Throughout the 1920s, the magazine The Nation exposed the suppression of speech. The lynchings and beatings of activists and the destruction of the Wobblies, for example, made it clear that people in America were not really free to speak their minds. Any art that showed sex at all, in any way, even the most oblique references, is banned. And the mail even refuses to send any items it deems to be overly sexual, and you didn't have to be very sexual to be overly sexual. Ulysses, James Joyce's masterpiece, one of my favorite books, for example, is banned. The city of Boston banned Upton Sinclair, Theodore Dreiser, and Ernest Hemingway. Soon, "Banned in Boston" became a marketing slogan. The Women's Christians Temperance Union, ironically drunk on their prohibition win, began to demand that movies be censored for morality. Movies, fearing regulation from the government, self-censored with something called the Hays Code. The Hays Code said things like, if somebody does something mainstream society considers evil in the film, they have to be punished by the end. You can't show infidelity. You can't really show casual sex. All these things were self-censored from the movies. One great example of this is in Casablanca, when Humphrey Bogart's character, Rick, meets up with his long-lost love, Ilsa, Ingrid Bergman, who's now married, of course. And the two of them are together in his room, and they're clearly moving towards having sex. They're fully clothed. They're just, flirting, and they're clearly in love. It cuts away out of nowhere to a lighthouse turning around for a second. And then it comes back, and Bogart smoking a cigarette, and Bergman is buttoning the top button of her shirt. You're just supposed to infer that they had sex. Now, by 1951, though, a movie called The Miracle upsets the Catholic Church, who sues over it. And it actually goes to the Supreme Court, who do rule that film is protected speech. The intellectuals of the era mocked the conservative of the 20s. The commentator H.L. Mencken calls us bubis americanus, conformist, moronic, peasants. Europeans consumed lots of American pop culture, but openly dismissed it as a wasteland intellectually. Many U.S. writers simply left the country. We call them the lost generation. Some had been traumatized by World War I. Others feared the suppression of speech in this country in the conservative 20s. And of course, many of them just wanted to drink freely. People like Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Gertrude Stein are in this group. Many people also consider the writers working in the 1920s to be the greatest collection of novelists in American history. Not only the ones I mentioned, but you see here the great Southern writer William Faulkner. And that's not even to mention, Thomas Wolfe, another great Southern writer, the great poets T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. I guess I shouldn't leave Sinclair Lewis out there. Sinclair Lewis wrote about the kind of hollowness and emptiness of a modern, suburban, consumerist lifestyle way back in the 1920s. There's nothing new about that. In 1920, a new organization emerges. The lawyers who had been defending free speech during World War I band together and create the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU. And they've effectively been at the center of all rights legislation since. The Supreme Court had not really considered civil liberties in this way until after World War I, and it didn't start well. The first significant case here is a case called Schenck v. United States. This is where a socialist is handing out anti-draft leaflets during the war, and he's arrested because obviously this is considered criticism of the war. Now, this is where Oliver Wendell Holmes, who you see there, writes his famous decision where he says that free speech must be protected unless it presents a clear and present danger. And of course, the example he uses is shouting fire in a crowded theater. Now, many of you who know that probably assumed that was Holmes saying, hey, this guy handing out pamphlets you don't like wasn't like shouting fire in a crowded theater. But no, that conviction was upheld because Holmes did consider encouraging people not to sign up for the draft to be a clear and present danger. And the government, of course, got to decide what was a clear and present danger, what was dangerous. So this is really no protection at all. In that same session, they upheld Debs and other anti-war critics' convictions as well. Also in that same session, the Supreme Court upheld the arrest of people simply for supporting the Soviet Union. But in that case, Holmes and Brandeis dissented. And their dissents would become the basis of the current modern defense of free speech. A few years later, in 1925, we get the Gitlow decision. Now, in Gitlow, we have another left-winger handing out leftist pamphlets, and he's arrested by the government because they don't like them. Now, Gitlow's conviction is actually upheld. But the reason it's such a key decision is because in that decision, the court makes it clear that the Bill of Rights applies to state governments. Now, because of a case called Barron v. Baltimore, which 1833, I believe, in that case, the Supreme Court had said the Bill of Rights only protects you from the federal government, but the state government was to take away your right to religion or force you to testify against yourself. They were welcome to do that. Now, because of the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court in 1925, 55 years after the 14th Amendment, decides that the Bill of Rights now protects you from the state government as well. And so despite the fact that Gitlow was actually convicted, at least we have, this is called incorporating the Bill of Rights. At least we have that here. Holmes, who dissented, would write about a marketplace of ideas, saying we shouldn't ban ideas. We should just trust that the bad ideas will lose out in this marketplace ideas. By the end of the decade, the Supreme Court has also struck down laws limiting speech in Kansas and Minnesota. And in 1930, it overturned a conviction for people sending sex education pamphlets through the mail. And in 1933, they decide that Ulysses is no longer banned, James Joyce's masterpiece, which I started this with, which is good because it's a great book.